the second topic here that we're going to talk about today is buck mentality and how that plays into the first rut versus the second rut. Buck mentality, by saying that, what I mean is you have to understand the thought process of a mature whitetail buck drastically changes from the first rut to the second rut. The first rut, you have, like we had touched on during stand placement, your first rut is 75 to 80% of your does are coming into heat. So it's a overabundance of chaos. It's an overabundance of needing to get those that dominance established, and it's a mentality that they gauge themselves, if you will. They set themselves up for the entire year, and especially going into that last week of October, first week of November. Their mentality switches away from food, and it really keys on pressure and them knowing, really relying on their nose and their eyesight, where they bed, where they feed, when they're going to bed, when they're going to feed, where their does are going to be at during certain parts of the day, taking in a estrus or 28-day period, as far as knowing the heat cycle. Now the heat cycle of them does are 28 days. The standing heat, like I always say, is that 4 to 6 hour period inside of a 22 to 26 hour period. So inside of that 22 to 26 hour period, that buck mentality is in overdrive on that doe, and then he knows where that doe is, obviously, and that breeding process takes place, and he's on his feet and he's searching. Food is a very, very small window during that time. He eats when he has the doe on lockdown, when he can grab a bite to eat here and there. He can stop at a water hole in the morning, late October, and or during the rut. But his mentality has nothing to do with food. It has nothing to do with survival. It has nothing to do other than the breeding process during the first rut. It's a time of the year that puts his mentality into super overdrive, if you will, and that's what makes and breaks the food chain or the dominance chain during the rut. So that's what his mentality is focused on. That's the contour, like we touched on in stand placements. All that is focused on in his world is focused on the first rut, and the last thing on his mind is food. Now, buck mentality during the second rut totally changes. And why is that? This changes a little bit because of where you're at in the country, but if you're in the Northeast, where we are, the Midwest, parts of the West, the extreme North, extreme Northeast, it totally changes back to food. Food's a very small window in the first rut. Food is a huge tool during the second rut. That's a huge switch for them, and the reason that is it's a piece of the survival puzzle. And in order for them to maintain their body weight, or to regain their body weight that they lost, 20-30% of their body weight on a 200-pound animal, you do the math, you're talking 30, 60, 30, 40, 50 pounds sometimes on a mature whitetail buck. This buck right here above my head is a perfect example. When that deer was harvested, I had some encounters with him early in the season. That deer was 300 pounds if he was an ounce, and when he was harvested the 15th of November, he was like 225, 230, and his entire body was we couldn't even process the deer. He had not gangrene, but he had holes poked in him. He had fever, everything in him because of the fight, and he had dropped. There was absolutely no fat on that entire carcass of the deer, and you guys have seen this, time and time again, I'm sure, when you're processing or you're seeing those skinned out animals, just lean, nothing on them, just shredded, like a professional athlete, if you will, just boxers or anybody that shreds that weight. That's that mentality. It has nothing to do with food. It has everything to do with losing all that to get that breeding process done during that time of the year. And like I said, going back to this, and now going into the second rut, is it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with survival, and a very small portion of that is the rut. they're not only eating in their bedding areas, which is going to be number 3 that we're going to talk about. They're not only eating in that bedding area, they're eating out now on your destination feed locations, your food plots, if you're on public ground, out on your oak flats, your secluded acorn ridges. That's where they're focusing that attention on. That's their destination, if you will, during that third feeding of the day, and third and fourth feeding of the day before they get back into that bed. But the bedding area, the third thing we're going to talk about here again, is going to supply that. They have to be able to eat. Their mentality goes from rut back to food. And so where does second rut tie into that? Second rut ties into that is because what happens is those does that transition from the 28 days that don't get bred, that regain, they already know that those does, whatever does they're going to be, or your doe fawns that come in to heat that first cycle, are going to be where that food is. So they know they're going to be there. So they're going to go out there and they're going to regain their body strength. And if the big question here, the big circle is if and when that takes place, a mature doe didn't get bred, comes back in, your doe fawn comes in to heat the first time, they're already going to be there. And then the chase begins, and if she's inside of that window where that breeding process can take place, they normally you do not see. One of the big key things to touch on is you don't see that, like we've talked about, where those satellite bedding areas are, where you can get inside of those, and that's that kind of that hidden area where those bucks draw those does away from the rest of the drama of the herd, in those little staging areas, if you will, where the breeding process takes place. What you'll see during this time of the year, what I've seen a lot, especially free range and also in our captive herd, is what you'll see is that doesn't happen back in those areas. One, and the main reason is it takes too much energy now to get back to those areas, and they don't want to expend that energy. I have physically seen and seen this firsthand on both sides of the fence, if you will. What happens is that breeding process will take place right out into the field, right out in the fields. If the doe, that young doe fawn is out there, maybe she will run to the edge of the field or whatever, and that's when you've seen the the videos are capturing these bucks breeding these does in late season. And that's why they don't want to expend the energy to go all the way back or get away from the herd like they do in that lockdown phase of the first rut, is because it's all burning energy, and they'll go back to eating. Now, there again, that's why stand placement and this whole second part of the rut is so powerful, because what happens is that doe fawn may get bred, and then that buck is right back out to feed again, and he's back out in that feed source. So that is why that early season stand placement is as strong, is because now, like I said, if you're watching this and you're from the Midwest, by all means, if you really feel that you can hunt those food plots in those destination areas, and I know some guys just, and I'm told that all the time, if I'm just preaching this and teaching this and it's not true in the Midwest. Well, I do this, I do this for a living. I design these properties the same way in a high pressure state as I do a non-pressured state or a low pressured state. Kansas, Missouri, parts of Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, them are all low pressured states. Down in the south, there's a lot of states down there that don't get near the pressure that we get up here. And yet, yes, you can get away with that. Do I recommend it? I'll say that 100 times more, 1,000 times more. No, I do not. It's because to me it's a pressure deal, and if you work on these bases, these steps of this approach that I have of not hunting those destination feed locations, it'll totally change your idea. And that's why is because you can take more advantage of the whole entire year of hunting, not just certain pieces, and by escalating that pressure on those destination feed locations. And this is why when you get to the second rut, you're still able to experience them high percentage sits, because you're not over pressured, and you're watching this happen from the outside in, and you're able to be successful when this happens. So that buck mentality is something huge to take into consideration. You have to understand that it totally switches and they go back to feed. So your success rate is higher now back in those areas. And one of the things we'll touch on here a little bit, I touched on a little bit before, but before you've got those bucks going off the trails and, you know, contour. Now if you see, and I touched on this the other day in one of my past videos, but if you hang a tree stand placement, and you physically see a buck today, whether he's, let's just say he's seeing from the stand, and if you have an ability to hunt the next day or two coming up, and you see him on a trail today, and you can possibly get that stand moved or another stand, whether, you know, that's where saddle hunting and all this stuff comes into play, the climbers, if you can physically move on him and the wind is going to be right, you need to do it. You need to be there tomorrow evening, the same time that you were there today when you seen him, and that same low pressure approach that you took to get in there and not bust him. You need to be in that spot, because there's a very, very high percentage chance, if he didn't get busted along that way, didn't get blown out of the food plots, then what's going to happen, or at night get chased off by predators, you know, all that stuff comes into play. But if you can take that out of the equation and you know he didn't get busted, there's a very, very high percentage chance that he's going to be on that same trail. And usually that same trail is the same trail now, going back to early season, is the same trails that the rest of your herd is using, where they won't do that, you know, high percentage of the time during the rut. They will focus back onto those trails in that herd mentality, where it's to follow the leader from feed to bed.